Britain's story begins long before modern monarchy, in an age of Celtic tribes and then Roman rule. In 43 AD, Emperor Claudius ordered the conquest of Britain. By about AD 87, Rome had annexed most of what is now England and Wales, creating the province of Britannia. Roman governors and governors-appointed kings ruled on behalf of Rome for nearly 4 centuries, building roads, cities and forts that still dot the landscape today. When Roman authority collapsed in the early 5th century, the island slipped into political fragmentation. During the centuries that followed, Germanic Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, like Wessex, Mercia, and Northumbria, rose and fell. It was from this turbulent era that a unified English monarchy slowly emerged. After Rome's withdrawal around 410 AD, Britain was divided among rival Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. For centuries, no single king ruled all the land. By the 9th century, the Kingdom of Wessex, in southern England, had become dominant. Its greatest king, Alfred the Great, ruled 871 to 899, famously defended Wessex against Viking invaders. Alfred and his descendants began to unite the island. His grandson Aethelstan, 924 to 939, conquered or negotiated with the other kingdoms. Aethelstan was the first to style himself King of the English, and many historians call him the founder of the English monarchy. Under Alfred's lineage, what had been a handful of Anglo-Saxon petty kingdoms became one realm of England. By 1066, however, the Anglo-Saxon monarchy was in crisis. King Edward the Confessor, 1042 to 1066, had no heir, and powerful nobles fought for control. Harold Godwinson briefly became king on Edward's death, but his reign was cut short. Duke William of Normandy, a distant cousin, claimed Edward had promised him the throne. In October 1066, William landed with a Norman army and defeated Harold at the Battle of Hastings. William was crowned King William I of England on Christmas Day 1066. William's victory ended over 1,000 years of Anglo-Saxon rule and brought a new dynasty. The Norman Conquest of 1066 had sweeping consequences. William I confiscated the lands of the Anglo-Saxon nobility and gave them to his Norman supporters. In doing so, he transformed England's aristocracy and tied the kingdom's fate to France. The new kings claimed ownership of all land under feudal law and even became nominal vassals to the King of France for their French possessions. The Normans built castles across England, military fortresses, and symbols of royal power. William I himself ordered the construction of the White Tower at the Tower of London, which stands today as an enduring symbol of his reign. William I's sons ruled in turn: William II, Rufus, 1087 to 1100, and Henry I, 1100 to 1135. Henry I strengthened royal administration, formalizing the royal household, creating the office of Chief Justiciar, a sort of chief minister, and making royal justice more accessible. Henry also married Matilda of Scotland, uniting Norman and Anglo-Saxon royal lines. But tragedy struck when his only legitimate son, William Adelin, died in a shipwreck. Henry named his daughter Empress Matilda as heir, but on his death in 1135, his nephew Stephen of Blois usurped the throne. This sparked a bloody civil war known as the Anarchy, 1135 to 1153. England was torn between supporters of King Stephen and Empress Matilda, neither side secure. Only when the nobility grew weary of fighting did Stephen agree to the Treaty of Wallingford, 1153, accepting Matilda's son as his heir. When Stephen died, Matilda's son Henry II, 1154 to 1189, became king, founding the long-lived Plantagenet dynasty, also called the Angevin. Henry II was one of England's most powerful medieval kings. He reformed the law and justice system, His legal changes became the foundation of England's common law system. Henry II expanded royal influence over Wales, Ireland, and even Scotland, forcing other kings to acknowledge him as overlord. His reign also saw the famous clash with Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, over church versus royal authority, a drama that foreshadowed later power struggles between kings and the church. Henry II's sons succeeded him. Richard I, Lionheart, 1189 to 1199, was a celebrated Crusader king who spent most of his reign abroad. His adventures in the Third Crusade and subsequent capture by the Holy Roman Emperor are legendary. Richard's brother John, 1199 to 1216, in contrast, proved a troubled ruler. John lost much of France and bled England's treasury with failed wars. Most famously, John's heavy taxes and abuses led to rebellion by the barons. In 1215, they forced him to agree to the Magna Carta, a charter that aimed to limit royal power and protect baronial rights. Magna Carta is often cited as a milestone in constitutional history, forcing the king to acknowledge that he was subject to the law. Henry II's grandson, Henry III, 1216 to 1272, inherited the throne as a boy. His long reign witnessed the rise of Parliament. Barons and bishops demanded a say in government, and in 1258 they imposed the Provisions of Oxford, requiring the king to share power with a council of nobles. Civil war briefly broke out, the Barons' Wars, but royal authority was eventually restored. During Henry III's reign, Westminster Abbey was rebuilt, and the idea took hold that even the monarch must obey the law. Henry III's son Edward I, 1272 to 1307, was a vigorous ruler. He summoned what became known as the Model Parliament in 1295, including commoners as well as nobles, to raise taxes for his wars. Edward I waged wars to conquer neighbouring realms. He completed the conquest of Wales, building castles like Caernarfon and Conwy, and intervened in Scotland's dynastic disputes. His claims led to the First War of Scottish Independence. Edward died on campaign in Scotland, but his reign firmly shaped England's medieval identity. Edward I was succeeded by his son Edward II, 1307 to 1327. Edward II struggled with noble factions and unpopular royal favourites. His reign saw the passing of the ordinances of 1311 aimed at restraining the king. Ultimately, Edward's relationship with the nobles deteriorated so badly that his wife Isabella of France and her lover Roger Mortimer led a revolt, captured Edward, and forced him to abdicate in 1327, the first formal deposition of an English king. The throne then passed to Edward II's son, Edward III, 1327 to 1377, who initially reigned under the guidance of his mother and Mortimer. As he grew in power, Edward III asserted royal authority and reignited conflict with France. In 1337, he claimed the French crown, through his mother, and launched the 100 Years' War. He won great victories at Crécy, 1346, and Calais, 1347, and introduced the royal insignia of 3 lions on gold, later adding the French fleur-de-lis. Under Edward's leadership, Parliament became more powerful, and the military innovations, like the longbow, changed warfare. Late in his reign, England suffered the Black Death from 1348 and growing social unrest, but Edward III left a legacy of chivalry and national ambition. Edward III's grandson, Richard II, 1377 to 1399, became king as a child. Although he quelled the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, his later rule became increasingly autocratic and unpopular. In 1399, his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, son of John of Gaunt, deposed him. Parliament declared Richard abdicated, and Henry took the crown as Henry IV inaugurating the Lancastrian branch of Plantagenets. Richard II's overthrow set a dangerous precedent by breaking the hereditary succession. It showed that an unpopular monarch could be removed by force. The 15th century Plantagenets were split between the houses of Lancaster and York, each claiming descent from Edward III. Henry IV, 1399 to 1413, dealt with rebellions and solidified Lancaster's hold on the throne. His son Henry V, 1413 to 1422, is remembered as a national hero. He made peace with his Lancastrian opponents, unified the kingdom, and turned England's attention back to France. In 1415, Henry V won a stunning victory at Agincourt and went on to conquer Normandy. By the Treaty of Troyes, 1420, he was recognized as heir to the French crown. His early death in 1422 left only an infant heir, Henry VI. Henry VI, 1422 to 1461, 1470 to 1471, inherited a troubled dual monarchy. He proved a weak king. By 1453, he had lost almost all his French territories. In 1453, Henry VI suffered a mental breakdown. Rival nobles, chiefly the Yorkist Duke of York and Henry's queen, Margaret of Anjou, clashed over control of the government. This power struggle exploded into the Wars of the Roses, 1455 to 1487, a dynastic civil war named after the Lancastrian red rose and Yorkist white rose emblems. York's son, Edward IV, 1461 to 1483, finally defeated the Lancastrians in 1461, and again after a brief Yorkist setback in 1470. Edward IV consolidated his rule, defeating Margaret's forces at Barnet and Tewkesbury. Meanwhile, Henry VI languished in captivity and was secretly murdered in the Tower of London. When Edward IV died in 1483, his young son Edward V was proclaimed king but never crowned. He and his brother disappeared amid palace intrigue. The throne was usurped by Edward IV's brother Richard III, 1483 to 1485. Richard III's reign was short and turbulent. In 1485, Henry Tudor, a Lancastrian claimant, invaded England. At the Battle of Bosworth Field, Richard III was killed, and Henry Tudor became Henry VII, founding the Tudor dynasty. Richard's death at Bosworth ended the Plantagenet line and closed a bloody chapter of royal conflict. The new Tudor king Henry VII, 1485 to 1509, was careful and shrewd. He married Elizabeth of York to unite the warring houses of Lancaster and York, ended private armies of the magnates, and restored royal authority. Henry VII re-established strong centralized rule and peace after the Wars of the Roses. His court was austere but effective, and he transformed the financial and legal machinery of government. Henry VII's son, Henry VIII, 1509 to 1547, is one of Britain's best-known kings. His reign was a time of dramatic change. Henry VIII famously married 6 times in search of a male heir. When Pope Clement VII refused to annul his first marriage to Catherine of Aragon, Henry took matters into his own hands. In 1534, he enacted the Acts of Supremacy, breaking England's ties with Rome and declaring himself supreme head of the new Church of England. This English Reformation dissolved monasteries, seized church lands, and transformed religion in Britain. Henry's reign also saw the annexation of Wales, united legally with England under the laws in Wales Acts, and the formal claim over Ireland. Henry VIII's son, Edward VI, 1547 to 1553, continued Protestant reforms but died as a teenager. His death sparked a succession crisis. Edward had named the Protestant lady Jane Grey as his heir to exclude his Catholic half-sister Mary. Jane reigned only 9 days before popular support brought Mary I, 1553 to 1558, to the throne. Mary I was determined to restore Catholicism. She married Philip of Spain and earned the nickname Bloody Mary for persecuting Protestants. Her reign saw England temporarily return to Rome, but it was unpopular. When Mary died in 1558, her half-sister Elizabeth I, 1558 to 1603, succeeded. Elizabeth was a strong and shrewd monarch. She re-established Protestantism, Elizabethan religious settlement, and skillfully balanced the interests of Parliament and the Church. Under Elizabeth, the English monarchy reached a golden age. The realm defeated the Spanish Armada in 1588, developed its seafaring and trading power, and sponsored voyages of exploration to the New World. Elizabeth governed for 45 years without producing an heir, making her the last Tudor monarch. Her era saw the monarchy become a symbol of national pride and stability. In 1603, the Tudor dynasty ended with Elizabeth I's death. The crown passed to the Scottish Stuarts. James VI of Scotland became James I of England and Ireland, 1603 to 1625. James I was the great-grandson of Henry VII, uniting the crowns in a union of the crowns. He styled himself King of Great Britain, though England and Scotland remained separate kingdoms under one monarch. James was a learned king. He commissioned the King James Bible, but also a firm believer in the divine right of kings. He famously quarrelled with a self-assertive English Parliament over taxes and religion. As Britannica notes, James was a strong advocate of royal absolutism, and his conflicts with an increasingly self-assertive Parliament set the stage for the rebellion against his successor. James's son, Charles I, 1625 to 1649, inherited these tensions. Like his father, Charles I governed with a heavy hand and insisted on raising revenue without parliamentary consent. His methods, including unpopular taxes and arrests of opponents, provoked resistance. In 1642, civil war broke out between the Royalists, Cavaliers, and Parliament's forces, Roundheads. The conflict ended with Charles I's defeat. In January 1649, Parliament tried and executed Charles I for treason. For the first and only time, a reigning English monarch had been beheaded. With the king gone, the monarchy was abolished, and Britain briefly became a republic under Oliver Cromwell's Commonwealth and Protectorate, 1649 to 1660. The monarchy was restored in 1660 when Charles II, son of Charles I, was invited back as king. Charles II, 1660 to 1685, won the throne with surprisingly little bloodshed. His reign, known as the Restoration, was more tolerant and fun-loving than his father's. He re-established the Church of England, but also navigated a Protestant country with some level of religious tolerance. Britannica calls him King of Great Britain and Ireland, restored to the throne after years of exile during the Puritan Commonwealth, noting that his reign is known as the Restoration period. Charles II's court patronised the arts, e.g., rebuilding of London after the Great Fire, and helped lay groundwork for a more modern society. But he also had to manage Parliament carefully, which had grown much stronger during the interregnum. Charles II died without legitimate heirs and was succeeded by his younger brother James II, r. 1685 to 1688. James II was openly Roman Catholic and tried to promote Catholic interests in a predominantly Protestant country. His actions, appointing Catholics to office, suspending laws, alarmed many English leaders. In 1688, Parliament and Protestant nobles invited James's Protestant daughter Mary and her husband William of Orange to take the throne. William and Mary landed in November 1688, and James II fled. Parliament formally deposed him in what became known as the Glorious Revolution. As Britannica observes, James II's overthrow permanently established Parliament as the ruling power in England. In February 1689, William III and Mary II were crowned joint monarchs. They accepted a Bill of Rights, 1689, that restricted royal power. The Crown could not suspend laws or levy taxes without Parliament's consent, and Catholics were barred from the throne. This marked the emergence of a constitutional monarchy in Britain, where the king or queen ruled by agreement with Parliament rather than by divine right alone. Mary died childless in 1694. William ruled alone until his death in 1702. Queen Anne, R. 1702 to 1714, the younger sister of Mary II, succeeded next. Anne's reign saw the final union of the English and Scottish crowns. In 1707, the Acts of Union came into effect, uniting the kingdoms of England and Scotland into a single kingdom of Great Britain, with a single parliament at Westminster. Anne became the first sovereign of Great Britain, cementing a united monarchy over the entire island of Britain. The Stuart line ended with Anne, who left no surviving heir. Under the 1701 Act of Settlement, passed earlier to ensure a Protestant succession, the throne passed to George I, 1714 to 1727, a German prince from Hanover. George I was the great-grandson of James I through his daughter Sophia of Hanover. In fact, George only became king because the Electress Sophia had died 2 months before Anne. He inherited the throne under the Act of Settlement 1701, bypassing dozens of closer Catholic claimants. The new House of Hanover ruled Britain for almost 2 centuries. The early George, I and II, 1714 to 1760, scarcely spoke English and relied heavily on ministers. These were the years when modern party politics took shape. Robert Walpole, appointed during George I's reign, emerged as Britain's first de facto prime minister, running government on behalf of the king. By this time, the monarchy was largely ceremonial and dependent on Parliament. Meanwhile, Britain grew as a naval and colonial power, facing wars in Europe and abroad. George III, 1760 to 1820, was the first Hanoverian born in Britain, and his reign was momentous. Early on, Britain won a global empire in the 7 Years' War, but then lost the American colonies to revolution. Later, George III led Britain through the long struggle against revolutionary and Napoleonic France. As Britannica notes, under George III, Britain won an empire, but lost its American colonies, and then, after, Napoleonic France emerged as a leading power in Europe. Near the end of his life, George suffered mental illness, and from 1811 his son, the future George IV, acted as regent. George III's sons, George IV, 1820 to 1830, and William IV, 1830 to 1837, reigned during a time of social reform and the gradual expansion of democracy, Reform Act of 1832. Although the monarchs still held powers, Parliament's role continued to grow. In 1837, George IV's niece Victoria became queen at age 18, beginning a new era. She was technically the last Hanoverian, though her consort Prince Albert was of the German house of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Queen Victoria, 1837 to 1901, reigned for 63 years, presiding over Britain's industrial might and imperial expansion. Her era was later called the Victorian Age. Under Victoria, the monarchy became more symbolic and ceremonial. Britannica observes, during her reign, the British monarchy took on its modern ceremonial character. Victoria also became Empress of India in 1876, as Britain's empire peaked. She was immensely popular at home and, through her children's marriages, an ancestor of many European royals. By the end of Victoria's reign, the monarchy had survived radical changes. Britain was now a constitutional monarchy, its government run by Parliament and Cabinet, with the King or Queen as head of state. After Victoria's death in 1901, her son Edward VII succeeded. Edward was from the House of Saxe-Coburg, and Gotha, his father was Prince Albert. But his reign, 1901 to 1910, maintained stability. In 1910, Edward's son George V became king. World events again tested the monarchy. During World War I, 1914 to 1918, anti-German sentiment ran high in Britain. In 1917, King George V made a dramatic move. He renounced his German titles and changed the royal family's name to Windsor. This founded the House of Windsor, named after Windsor Castle, and symbolised the monarchy's British identity. George V, reigned 1910 to 1936, continued as a popular constitutional monarch. He presided over the dissolution of the British Empire into a commonwealth of independent realms, such as Canada and Australia. His eldest son, Edward VIII, briefly took the throne in 1936, but Edward abdicated the same year to marry divorcee Wallis Simpson. Edward's brother George VI became king, 1936 to 1952, at the outbreak of World War II. George VI provided steady leadership through the war, famously rallying the nation. In 1952, Elizabeth II, R. 1952 to 2022, ascended as Britain's Queen at age 25. She became the longest-reigning British monarch in history. Elizabeth II's reign saw the end of the empire and the rise of the modern United Kingdom and Commonwealth. Under her, the monarchy became even more symbolic and apolitical. A figurehead of national continuity, she was widely respected for her sense of duty and service. Elizabeth's death in September 2022 marked the end of an era. Upon her death, Charles III, born 1948, became king. Charles had been heir for decades, as Prince of Wales, and had shown keen interest in charity, the environment, and interfaith dialogue. As king, he inherits a 21st century constitutional monarchy. Charles III's reign, 2022 to present, carries forward centuries of tradition. While much has changed since Alfred the Great's time, the royal family remains Britain's oldest continuous institution, a living thread through history, from ancient tribes and Roman emperors to our modern day.